The Allied nations faced a daunting task in their mutual goal of rolling back the Nazi Empire that had been assembled since the onset of the war in Europe in 1939. By the beginning of 1942, Hitler's armies had occupied large sections of Western Europe for 2 years, and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union had already been in a death struggle with the Nazis for nearly a year. The Nazis had efficiently worked to consolidate their gains after defeating rival armies, and Hitler had appropriated the wealth, natural resources, agricultural production, and industrial capacity of Europe to feed and supply his armies. The German army was seasoned, well-commanded, and confident in victory by 1942, and none of the Allied powers, now composed of the United Kingdom and the United States and the Soviet Union, believed the Nazis would quickly surrender or that they would be easily defeated. Supreme Allied command for operations in the European theater was given to a Midwestern chain-smoking American from a family of religiously devout pacifists. Dwight D. Eisenhower was one of 6 brothers from Abilene, Kansas, who really pursued a military career because he sought the free college education he could obtain by receiving a commission to West Point. Eisenhower graduated as a member of the West Point class of 1915, known as the class the stars fell on, for the numerous officers and generals the class would produce as World War II commanders. Eisenhower trained with tanks during World War I, but was never deployed to France and never saw combat. During the interwar years, he earned a reputation as a superb staff officer and an organized planner that many generals sought to have as their chief of staff. Upon U.S. entry into the war in Europe, many believed the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, George C. Marshall, would be granted the coveted command of Supreme Commander in Europe, but President Roosevelt eagerly desired for Marshall to stay near him in Washington, and Eisenhower was named Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Eisenhower was a strong tactician and strategist, but the greatest strength that he demonstrated during the war was his ability to forge a coalition of nations and their armies and keep the coalition together. Eisenhower demonstrated strong political skills that were necessary for the Supreme Commander. He worked closely with Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He held the respect of President Franklin Roosevelt. He effectively handled the enormously arrogant French General Charles de Gaulle, and he also kept British and American generals working together and resolved their endless disputes. As Supreme Commander of a unified command of several nations, Eisenhower was an essential asset for the Allied cause. Churchill lobbied for the Allies to commence their campaigns to liberate Western Europe by beginning in North Africa. North Africa represented the extreme southern holdings of the Nazis and empowered them to maintain widespread influence strategically on the Mediterranean Sea as they held its northern and southern coasts. By invading one of those coasts, the Allies would gain additional access to the Mediterranean and have an effective jumping-off point for future landings in southern Europe. Taking North Africa would also prevent the Allies from being surrounded as they moved north. Operation Torch was the Allied invasion of North Africa, featuring 3 task forces that would land on the North African coast. While some units landed without opposition, the Americans who came ashore in Morocco faced strong resistance from Vichy France troops allied with the Nazis. Besides militarily subduing the opposing Vichy France, the Allies cut several deals to get the French to allow the Allies to land without opposition. The Americans and British would then be able to proceed towards the east to root out the Nazi forces occupying Tunisia, Libya, and portions of Egypt. As Allied units moved from the west towards the east, they hoped to trap Axis forces in a vise in the middle, with British units moving from the east towards the west. As a colonial possession, the British hoped to defend Egypt and use it as a base to conduct further operations against the Axis. British forces successfully held off German units from conquering Egypt, but it was not until 1942 that they were able to secure a significant victory at El Alamein. Particularly in the second battle, British forces finally proved the Germans could be beat on the battlefield and provided Allied forces in North Africa a much-needed boost in morale. In command at the Second Battle of El Alamein was the British General Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery, who is often simply referred to as Monty, was a highly disciplined and very competent general, but also an extremely arrogant commander whose confidence in his own abilities often bordered on insubordination. By a stroke of good fortune for Monty, he was not supposed to be in command in Egypt, but when the assigned commander perished in a plane crash, command of British forces in North Africa fell to Monty. His successful rout of the Germans in the east moved him to the top of the list of British ground commanders for the remainder of the war. The war in North Africa may have started to go well for the British in the east, but operations for the Americans started with disaster. In a 2-mile wide pass in the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia, green American troops went into battle for the first time against the great Desert Fox, the German General Erwin Rommel. The Americans were bested at multiple points. American equipment failed or was not used properly. Commanders were not prepared and performed poorly during the course of the battle. At times, the American troops did not demonstrate the requisite battlefield discipline. The Americans suffered over 3,000 troops killed and wounded and another 3,000 captured as POWs by the Axis. The Axis suffered 1/3 such losses. Moreover, American units were driven back up to 50 miles and faced a German counterattack. This was a critical moment for the Allied effort. The danger existed that American morale would collapse, that troops would be spooked by the presence of Rommel on the other side, and that the campaign of liberation would stall before even beginning. Eisenhower acted quickly to prevent these possibilities. Equipment was improved, units were reconstituted, and probably most importantly, Eisenhower relieved the existing general of command and assigned a more determined personality in command of American troops in North Africa. The new general Eisenhower installed was the tough-minded and legendary George S. Patton. At times, Patton could be brusque to a fault and suffered public embarrassment for his aggressive language, but Eisenhower did see in him a commander who was determined to fight at all costs and keep the enemy on a run. Patton had enjoyed a colorful career as a horseman, polo player, and also an Olympian. Patton participated in the pentathlon in the 1912 Summer Olympics, placing a respectable 4th. Patton graduated from West Point Military Academy in 1909 and received a commission as a cavalry officer. Patton experienced combat in World War I and from an early point saw the value and necessity of tank warfare. Along with his friend Eisenhower, Patton trained with tanks and wrote regarding their value during the interwar years. He rightfully forecasted that after the muddy, stalemated trenches of World War I, the next war would be a war of movement, in which tanks would play a critical role. For all his blustering skill as a strategist and a fighter, it was Patton's style that often earned him newspaper headlines and some unwanted press. Patton enjoyed dressing in military uniforms, featuring his ivory-handled revolvers at his side, and cursing and swearing with exuberance at unwitting subordinates. His aggressive style would make him both the hero and the villain among American GIs. Patton came from extensive military roots and was thrilled that World War II finally gave him another chance to command troops in battle. While Patton had limitless respect for brave soldiers who were injured in combat, he demonstrated a startling insensitivity to soldiers who were psychologically traumatized by battle. At one point, Patton would slap and swear at a soldier in a field hospital who was suffering from battle fatigue and earned the disdain of Eisenhower for the act of masculine bravado. Patton was forced to apologize to the soldier and eagerly awaited for his superiors to respect him again. Eisenhower selected Patton to command American troops after their defeat at Kasserine Pass because he knew Patton would install the discipline that American troops needed after the defeat. Patton pushed his men hard and introduced strict standards to prepare the troops for the next engagement with Rommel's forces. That engagement would take place in the desert again at El Guitar. This time American troops, particularly of the 1st Infantry Division, performed better during battle and drove the Germans from the field. El Guitar represented the first American victory against Nazi forces and the beginning of the campaign to liberate Tunisia and the whole of North Africa from Nazi influence. By the middle of 1943, Axis forces in North Africa had been defeated, and the Allies could turn their attention to the north in their campaign to liberate Europe. For the first time in 1943, the three leaders of the biggest states among the Allies met for the first time at a conference in Tehran, Iran. While the three leaders did not always trust each other completely, the three did work together towards the common goal of defeating Nazi Germany. At Tehran, the Big Three, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, and Winston Churchill of Great Britain, agreed to open a second front in Western Europe to pull Nazi divisions back from the Soviet Union and to create a pincer movement that would chop up and destroy Nazi Germany in the middle. The Big Three also made future plans regarding the war and even began to discuss what the post-war world would look like when victory was assured. With Axis forces subdued in North Africa, the Allies could then launch their campaign to the north. While many, particularly Stalin, pushed for a second front being opened in France in 1943, the Allies continued to maneuver north from the Mediterranean in hopes of moving directly north into Germany. The island of Sicily, at the base of the Italian peninsula, was selected as the next target to liberate. Although mountainous and tricky to navigate, seizing Sicily would provide the Allies with a base to conduct forthcoming operations into Italy. Codenamed Operation Husky, the invasion of Italy commenced in July 1943 when American units under the command of General George S. Patton and General Omar Bradley landed on the southern coast of the island. British forces under General Montgomery landed on the southeast corner. The invasion of Sicily would resemble the Allied campaigns to come, in that a competitive spirit set in between the American and British forces to see which side could reach the northeast objective of Messina first, and in the process obtain the most glory. Patton was frustrated that he was first ordered to take Palermo in the north, but speedily moved east and headed towards Messina. The British should have had a clear shot and path north towards Messina along the east coast of Sicily, but they quickly became bogged down in the high mountains. Meanwhile, aggressively, and at times recklessly, Patton drove his American troops relentlessly across the broad expanses of the island rapidly toward Palermo. After liberating the northern town, Patton raced towards Messina to beat Monty upon his arrival. Patton even recklessly risked the lives of his men in a series of ill-advised amphibious landings solely in an effort to beat Monty. Patton was thrilled when he succeeded in doing so. Despite the unnecessary race between the two sides, Sicily was now in Allied hands, and the first area of Axis home front was taken away from the enemy. Axis forces would fight with even more ferocity as the Allies moved towards the homeland of the fascist dictator Mussolini. Not content to leave the defense of Italy to Mussolini's Italian troops, Hitler poured several divisions into the Italian peninsula to give the Allies a rough time in their efforts to liberate the peninsula. British forces landed in September of 1943 near the base of the Italian peninsula and planned operations to march north. In what was supposed to be a secret operation, American forces landed at Salerno, further north on the Italian boot behind even some German lines. The initial landings went reasonably well and landed thousands of troops and equipment on the peninsula, but gradually the increased German divisions quickly stalled the Allied advance. German heavy guns blasted Allied troops as they attempted to slog north and as they endeavored to land additional forces. Italian villages were often destroyed by the time they were liberated, and a significant refugee crisis began to develop among Italian civilians, with food shortages being pervasive. By the beginning of 1944, the Allied effort in Italy was still bogged down, and Rome would remain in Axis hands until the summer of that year. Heavy casualties weakened forces on both sides, but the Allied campaign in Italy had at least achieved the goal of diverting German divisions away from northern Europe, opening the possibility for another front in the north. Priceless historical and artistic sites were also often the casualty of the Allied campaign. Allied bombers reluctantly targeted the medieval monastery at Monte Cassino because it sheltered German snipers and artillery positions. While General Eisenhower made an effort to avoid destroying significant sites, He also did not let cultural sites stand in the way of Allied progress to liberate the peninsula. Shortly before the Allies landed on the peninsula, the Italian dictator was forced out of the government in his role as prime minister. The Italian king had Mussolini taken into custody. Yet El Duce was soon rescued by German paratrooper commandos and installed as the head of a makeshift puppet state in northern Italy. The Italian Social Republic was a hastily constructed state with Mussolini at its head in northern Italy. The only reason the state even existed was due to the multiple German tank divisions that propped it up. The Republic was never really a viable state, and additional Axis losses on additional fronts would lead to its collapse and fall. The Allies' plan to open a second front against the Nazis in the West faced an enormous, formidable challenge. Ever since the Nazis had gained control of Western Europe, they had set about building a series of fortifications and defensive works that became known as the Atlantic Wall. From the northern reaches of Norway, along the coast of Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and particularly France, the Nazis had constructed an impressive array of fortifications designed to obstruct and block any attempt by the Allies to land troops on the continent. After his Africa Corps had been defeated and driven from North Africa, the task of constructing defensive fortifications fell to General Erwin Rommel. Rommel instilled a sense of urgency into his subordinates to build an impregnable fortress as possible throughout the Atlantic Wall to thwart the Allied advance. He personally inspected the defensive works and found additional weaknesses to be addressed. On the beaches, Rommel had his troops install a multitude of mines, anti-tank, and anti-ship obstructions. Sometimes nicknamed Rommel's asparagus, large beams of steel or oak beams were assembled on the beaches of the Atlantic Wall that when the tide came in would be covered and could rip open the hull of an incoming ship. A series of concrete gun emplacements and pillboxes were assembled along the coast that were aimed towards the beaches and the English Channel. Steel-reinforced concrete bunkers with an interlocking tunnel system laced the coast together with an impressive fortress of defenses. Thousands of troops manned thousands of machine guns that were purposefully trained on every inch of the beaches so that targets could be hit from a multitude of angles. The Germans were so effective in the construction of their fortifications that any troops that endeavored to approach the beaches would be met with an onslaught of mines, bullets, mortars, grenades, and shells. The Germans knew the Allies were coming. The only question was where. Most Nazi commanders were convinced the Allies would conduct the cross-channel invasion by jumping from England to France at the narrowest point of the channel, between Dover, England, and Calais, France. The channel is only 21 miles at that point and would have made an easier jump for the Allies. The Nazis prepared their defenses for a multitude of invasion points, but they remained convinced the crossing would take place from Dover to Calais. Instead, the Allies secretly eyed the larger landing beaches of the Normandy region in northern France. For over a year, the operation to invade France at Normandy, codenamed Overlord, was planned and practiced and kept top secret from German intelligence. The operation would be enormous, with many component elements. Only twice in world history had a commander successfully conducted a cross-channel invasion, those of Julius Caesar and William, Duke of Normandy, and now an American general from Kansas in Eisenhower would attempt the same. The Operation Overlord would commence with British and American paratroopers dropping in the night before the invasion behind enemy lines and securing key rail, road, and bridge crossings. Disembarking from numerous locations throughout Britain, Allied forces would disembark and land on 5 beaches in Normandy the next morning. The 3 British and Canadian beaches were codenamed Gold, Juno, and Sword. The 2 American beaches for landings were codenamed Utah and Omaha. The entire operation was scheduled for early June and was heavily dependent on calm seas and clear skies for the invasion to take place. The Overlord invasion force would be the largest in history. 11,590 aircraft would fly 14,674 sorties. 127 of the aircraft would be lost. 6,039 would participate in Operation Neptune, the naval operation to support Overlord. 156,000 troops would be deployed, of which there would be over 10,000 casualties, 4,413 of which being Allied deaths. The defending Germans would suffer somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 deaths. For months in advance, American troops poured into the British Isles, amassing for the invasion. They spent much of their time planning and rehearsing for the invasion, but there was also an abundance of leisure time to see England, experience London, and fraternize with local Brits. American GIs were particularly drawn to the nightclubs and dance halls of London, Rainbow Corner in Piccadilly probably being the most famous. American GIs taught British girls American dances such as swing and foxtrot. Romantic attachments were quickly formed as many British males were deployed in North Africa or aboard Royal Navy ships in the Atlantic. Many of the American GIs knew the invasion was coming and worried they would not make it through alive, so there was an increase in the number of hastily conducted marriages and births in England while Americans were stationed there. Most of these marriages would end in divorce after the war, but some actually proved to be enduring. In an effort to confuse the Nazis regarding where the D-Day landings would be occurring, a large-scale operation in subterfuge was conducted, codenamed Fortitude. Operation Fortitude would do everything it could to divert the Nazis from thinking the invasion would take place in the area of Normandy. An enormous amount of phony radio traffic was broadcasted that seemed to imply the invasion would take place in Norway, Spain, or Greece, anywhere but Normandy. Numerous inflatable tanks were blown up and placed at Dover, across from the Pas de Calais, in an effort to imply the Allies were massing forces to conduct the invasion from Dover to Calais. Rubber boats were assembled on local rivers in England that were supposedly designated to invade Norway. Such inflatables, when viewed from high-altitude reconnaissance planes, seemed to appear realistic and succeeded in tricking the Germans. A second lieutenant in the British forces named Clifton James bore such a startling resemblance to General Montgomery that he posed as the general and traveled to North Africa a few weeks before the invasion and attended public receptions. Newspapers reported the lieutenant's presence there as Monty, and thus the Nazis assumed the invasion could not have been imminent if the overall ground commander was not even in England. Of course, the real Montgomery was in England, working to plan the ground component of the invasion. Operation Fortitude was designed to conceal the enormously large invasion force that was being formed in England and its true destination of Normandy. The invasion was meticulously planned with British paratroopers taking a key canal and its bridge to support British and Canadian forces landing at Gold, Juno, and Sword. The 82nd and 101st Airborne would drop into the Cotentin Peninsula the night before the invasion and secure the towns and roads leading to the American landing beaches at Utah and Omaha. Secrecy was paramount, as several reserve panzer divisions could be sent to meet the Allies on the beaches and destroy them without giving the landing a chance of success. Equally important as well was weather. In order for Operation Overlord to succeed, the ships and landing craft had to have stable seas and clear skies. The decision of when to launch the invasion was essential. Failure of the invasion force would probably postpone another attempt for up to a year. Eisenhower assembled the Supreme Allied Command at Southwick House, just outside Portsmouth, England. The stakes were enormous as the Supreme Command staff met. The Allied Air Force needed weather to fly in. The Navy needed no more than moderate seas in which to sail. Moonlight and tidal conditions needed to be right as well. Thousands of Allied troops waited on ships, tossing up and down, waiting for the command to go. Airmen waited on tarmacs, waiting for the command to load up and take off. The invasion was planned to be launched at the beginning of June 1944. All conditions for a successful landing would be right at that time. Yet as the date approached, Group Captain James Stagg, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, warned of worsening conditions. Reluctantly, Eisenhower made the decision to postpone the invasion. Troops grew increasingly restless with more waiting. The longer the invasion fleet waited, the chances of maintaining secrecy were reduced. Eisenhower's staff met again in the middle of the night on June 4th. Captain Stagg gave an optimistic weather report and believed a front was approaching that would provide some acceptable conditions on June 6th, when conditions would still be right. After 2 a.m. in the morning, early on June 5th, the group met again, and the final weather report confirmed the previous one. Eisenhower polled his commanders going around the table. Almost all agreed it was time to go. Eisenhower finally paused, and then finally said, "Okay, we'll go." With that, commanders of the Army, Navy, and Air rushed from the room to order their subordinates to load up and get ready for the invasion. Eisenhower got a few hours of sleep, and then on the afternoon of the 5th, went out to meet the American paratroopers who were getting ready to drop into France. Meeting with the men at Grenham Common Airfield, he laughed and joked with the men and talked about home. Cheering them on, he made his leave. Units of the 82nd and 101st Airborne loaded up with over 100 pounds of gear in their planes. They took off shortly after midnight, eager, excited, nervous, and restless. They made their way over the channel and then encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire from German emplacements below in the French countryside. With several planes and paratroopers being hit, many of the troops jumped from their planes even before they had made it to their drop zones. The men deployed their parachutes and dropped into the night into enemy-occupied territory, often miles from their target areas. Paratroopers dropped into fields, ponds, lakes, trees, barns, and backyards. It was nearly impossible to discern where one was, and nothing seemed to line up on the maps. Slowly, desperate units found each other in the French countryside and endeavored to figure out where they were. Many of them made their way to Saint-Mère-Église, a French village a few miles from the American landing zone of Omaha Beach, at which Americans would be landing in a few hours at dawn. Other American paratroopers dropped directly into the town, on top of buildings and right above the German sentries firing at them with machine guns. Fires broke out in the village, which sucked the dropping parachutists in. Many got hung up on the telephone poles or trees and were shot dead by the Germans on the ground. The Germans initially held the town, but then retired. The Americans took the town in the middle of the night with reinforcements. Saint-Mère-Église became the first French town liberated from the Allied landings. The town church was the scene of some heavy fighting and is remembered for one particularly interesting story. American paratrooper John Steele descended on Saint-Mère-Église until his chute got stuck on one of the spires of the church. Steele was left suspended near the top of the church. As the church bells in the belfry began to ring for alarm, Steele had to play dead and not cover his ears so that the Germans on the ground would not see him or shoot him. As a result, Steele went deaf for a few days after the non-stop bell ringing. Nevertheless, he survived to tell the story. The stained glass windows in the church of Saint-Mère-Église still commemorate the American paratroopers who liberated the town early on the morning of D-Day. Other units of British paratroopers also dropped into Normandy on the night before the invasion. Their critical mission was to secure control of the Orne River Canal and its key bridge. Many British paratroopers were huddled inside of wood gliders that were towed behind larger aircraft. Once both planes were over Normandy, the lead plane detached the cable, pulling the glider, and the glider slowly dropped into the countryside below. British paratroopers took heavy losses and damaged equipment as they dropped into Normandy. Enough units, however, were able to secure the canal bridge after beating back German defenders. The British held the bridge throughout the night and waited for ground units to relieve them the next morning. The entirety of the airborne operations were designed to enhance the odds for a successful invasion landing in the coming morning. At last, the mighty armada of Allied ships got underway from England and headed towards the Normandy coast. It turns out the weather reports were accurate. A nice break in rough weather occurred through the night and into the morning of June 6. Visibility for aircraft was not perfect, but nevertheless adequate. Seas were sufficiently calm for the landings to take place. Mine-sweeping naval ships moved in first, clearing sea lanes for larger landing vessels. Battleships followed that commenced the shelling of the Normandy coast. The naval bombardment followed what had been weeks and weeks of coastal bombing by Allied bombers. Intended to accompany the troops onto the beaches that morning were makeshift amphibious tanks. Standard Sherman tanks were outfitted with a canvas housing that could be raised around the tank and provide buoyancy. The amphibious tanks had been extensively tested in England and had shown great promise. Infantrymen were encouraged, knowing that some heavy armor would be storming the beaches with them on the same morning. The amphibious tanks turned out to be one of the greatest failures on the day of the invasion. Choppy waves flooded engines, swamped crew cabins, and shredded the canvas housings. Many men drowned inside their tanks, failing to get out in time as they sank to the bottom. Only a few tanks made it on shore and were of limited assistance. Many of the failed amphibious tanks that sank in the channel still remain there today. Thus, without much armored support, it would be up to the men who loaded into their landing craft to take the beaches on foot. Finally being freed from their troop transports, American, British, and Canadian soldiers descended rope ladders to the shallow draft landing craft awaiting below. Slowly, the landing craft headed for the shore, which was increasingly obscured by mist, smoke, and explosions. The landings at Gold, Juno, and Sword for British and Canadian forces went relatively easy, as the defending Germans only put up light resistance. The Americans landing at Utah initially had a rough time against the German defenses, but before long made their way inland. It was at Omaha Beach that the Americans faced the toughest landing. Unlike the other beaches, Omaha Beach featured a wide open expanse from the sea, during which rushing infantry would be completely exposed and unprotected. At the end of the expanse was a very high bluff, terrain that ascended very quickly up from the shore. The bluff was encased with German mortar and machine gun emplacements, as well as mines, pillboxes, and barbed wire. The landing craft that carried the men towards the invasion beaches were known as Higgins boats, named after Andrew Jackson Higgins, who had developed shallow draft craft to navigate the bayou surrounding New Orleans. Now these same craft motored towards the coast, loaded down with men in their teens and 20s. As the spray of the sea splashed inside their boat, some men prayed, others shook with fear, others vomited and lost control of their bowels out of fear for what they were about to face. Men looked at each other silently, wondering who would be dead first, them or their buddy. Ever closer, the craft came to the shoreline. The awaiting Germans were now aware that the invasion had come. Alarms had been sounded, and they manned their large gun and machine gun positions. They waited until the landing craft were in range before opening fire. Larger artillery pieces were hidden inside of bunkers and encased in surrounding concrete. Only a direct hit would disable the firepower inside. Turrets aimed in every direction as the men approached the beach. The motors that drove the Higgins boats to the shore finally died down once the craft had run aground on the sand. Immediately, the front door dropped on the vessel, exposing the men inside as they tried to run out onto the sand. Immediately, German machine guns trained at the front of the vessels poured a devastating fire into the craft. Many men were struck dead before they could take their first step out of the boat. Bodies folded and collapsed immediately in front of troops in the rear. Men couldn't move. They were pinned. Several started climbing over the side and fell into the water. The hail of machine gun fire, mortar explosions, and large gun shells exploding filled the air. There were no safe spaces in the surf or on the sand. Men loaded down with too much equipment were dragged down beneath the waves. Others were shot before they could make it out of the water. The water was above the heads of some, chest high for others, and waist high for still more, requiring them to struggle and stagger forward towards the shore and sand. The explosions were deafening. Gunfire was everywhere. Legs, arms, torsos, and heads were blown into the air, only to descend on top of the other advancing troops. There was nowhere to go except towards the beach and the oncoming fire. There was no place to hide, barely any cover to be found. Bodies fell everywhere. Pools of blood formed around dead bodies. Gear was strewn everywhere. Rommel's asparagus provided little to hide behind. Men had to keep moving up the beach as wave after wave of troops continued to land and pour onto the beach. The beaches became strewn with wrecked and blown up equipment and vehicles. Frequently, it was not possible to know which body part belonged to which body. Sometimes advanced units that got pinned down on the beach were crushed by additional landing craft and vehicles approaching in second and third waves. Omaha Beach became a sea of confusion, traffic, disorganization, chaos, and death. The bluff was so high and so heavily fortified, so thoroughly mined, and so well defended that by the afternoon on June 6, many soldiers were pinned down on the so-called shingle. The shingle was a slight ridge comprised of rocks and sand that the ocean had slowly built up over time. Men that stayed low could rest for a moment behind the shingle out of the direct fire of German machine gunners. The afternoon was the critical time, as units had suffered heavy casualties. Wounded men needed to be evacuated. The dead were strewn all about, and there seemed to be no place to go. Dejection set in among the men. There was some talk of retreating back to the landing craft and evacuating the beach. Instead, to halt the collapse into despondency, two significant officers were on the beach that day that rallied the men. The first, Brigadier General Norman Cota, assessed the situation and ordered the Rangers to move forward with Bangalore torpedoes and other explosives to break a hole in the seawall so that the troops could pour through. He challenged them with the words, "If you are Rangers, then get up there and lead the way." He also motivated the troops by declaring, "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." The second significant officer was Colonel George Taylor, who declared to the troops cowering at the shingle, "There are two types of people who are going to stay on this beach, those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." The words of these two officers meant the difference. U.S. Army Ranger units punched a hole in the bluff. The troops popped up and ran through the opening. Up and over the bluff they went, eliminating German defenders as they moved. Enough troops moved forward, leaving unnecessary equipment and the dead behind them on the shingle. All across Omaha Beach, men, material, and vehicles littered the beach. A total of 4,413 Allied soldiers died during D-Day in Normandy, France on June 6, 1944. Americans suffered the largest number of casualties, with 2,499 American soldiers killed. The Allies were able to seize all 5 of the landing beaches, with Omaha finally secured by the end of the day. Assault troops were able to move inland, and immediately behind them followed a seemingly endless line of men, vehicles, weapons, machinery, and supplies. Essential to the success of the landings was a simultaneous operation given to other U.S. Ranger units at a unique landform jutting out from the Normandy coast, known as Point du Hoc. This large cliff formation with a very small, rocky shore at its base ascended 100 feet almost directly out of the ocean at the shoreline. On top of this point, the Germans had installed large guns to rain down death and destruction on the landing beaches miles away. The Allies knew they had to eliminate the guns at the top of Point du Hoc. For weeks, Allied aircrews bombed Point du Hoc relentlessly, understanding its danger to an assault force on the neighboring Normandy beaches. The area on top of and around Point du Hoc is still heavily cratered due to the bombing today. U.S. Army Rangers were assigned the grueling task of landing on the very small rocky beach and then ascending the cliffs of Point du Hoc using ladders and grappling hooks. All the while, German soldiers were firing down upon the Rangers from the top of the cliffs. Remarkably, the Rangers made it to the top of the cliffs and took the heights. At the top of Point du Hoc, they found concrete encasements and emplacements for large guns to be fired at the Normandy beaches. The guns had been pushed back and concealed, but the Ranger mission to the top of Point du Hoc was one of the most outstanding accomplishments by American forces on D-Day and potentially saved thousands of lives. After so much planning and remarkable execution, D-Day was a great success. For only the third time in world history, a cross-channel invasion was conducted successfully. The beachhead was secured at Normandy, provided the Allies with access to the continent, at which they proceeded to unload a seemingly infinite amount of men and equipment. There were many more bloody battles to come on the Western Front, but after D-Day, there was a sense among the Allies that victory was inevitable and that Nazi Germany was starting to collapse.